When Nathan Ridge Walker found the half-dead woman chained to a rotting post in the abandoned Indian stockade, her dress torn and bloodied, her spirit nearly broken but her eyes still burning with defiance, he had no idea that saving her life would cost him everything he'd built in 20 years of mountain living, and that she would prove to be the strongest person he'd ever met. The morning mist clung to Devil's Canyon like the ghosts of 1,000 broken promises, thick and cold, swallowing the pine trees whole until only their tops pierced through like the masts of sunken ships. The air tasted of snow and pine sap, with an undertone of something else, something that made the hair on the back of Ridgewalker's neck stand up like a wolf catching scent of a grizzly. Ridge had been tracking the rogue band of Crow warriors for 3 days now, following their trail through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. These weren't tribal hunting parties or war bands following ancient codes of honor. These were outcasts, exiled from their own people for crimes too dark to speak of in polite company. They raided isolated homesteads, took what they wanted, left nothing but burned timber and shallow graves. The tracks led deeper into the canyon, where the walls rose like cathedral stones on either side, blocking out most of the morning sun. Ridge moved silent as smoke through the underbrush, his buckskin clothes blending with the shadows, his rifle held ready, but not raised. 20 years in these mountains had taught him that hasty movements meant quick deaths. He'd first heard about the raids from a dying settler he'd found near Copper Creek, a man named Thomas Carpenter, whose farmstead had been hit 4 days prior. The man had lived just long enough to gasp out a story that chilled Ridge's blood. His daughter, Eliza May, had been taken alive. Ridge had known the Carpenter family by reputation, hard-working German immigrants who'd carved a small farm out of the wilderness with nothing but determination and prayers. Thomas Carpenter was known as an honest man who treated the local tribes with respect, trading fairly and never cheating on measurements. That these rogue warriors had hit his farm meant nowhere was safe anymore. The stockade appeared through the mist like a fever dream, made real, a collection of sharpened logs driven into the earth, forming a rough circle perhaps 50 feet across. It was old, built by fur traders decades ago, and abandoned when the beaver runs played out. The logs were grey with age, many rotting at the base, but they still stood tall enough to keep prisoners in and curious eyes out. Ridge crept closer, using the morning fog as cover. The camp was eerily quiet, no guards visible, no smoke rising from cooking fires. Either the raiders had moved on, or they were sleeping off a night of drinking and violence. Ridge's gut told him it was the former, but his eyes searched every shadow anyway. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been the wind through the pines. But Ridge's ears had been trained by 2 decades of listening for sounds that didn't belong. It was human, barely audible, the kind of noise someone makes when they're trying not to make any noise at all. He found a gap between 2 rotting logs and peered into the stockade. What he saw there made his jaw clench and his finger tighten. Involuntarily on his rifle trigger, a woman sat chained to a thick post in the center of the enclosure, her back against the rough wood. Her head tilted forward, so her auburn hair fell across her face like a curtain. Her dress, what remained of it, had once been blue calico, the kind worn by respectable farming women. Now it was torn, stained with dirt and blood, hanging in tatters that barely preserved her modesty. The chain around her ankle was thick and crude, the kind used for securing horses or cattle. It had rubbed her skin raw, leaving angry red marks that spoke of days of struggle. Her hands were bound behind the post with rawhide strips that had tightened as they dried, cutting into her wrists, but it was her face that made Ridge's breath catch in his throat. Despite everything, the captivity, the abuse, the hopelessness of her situation, there was something unbroken in her expression. Her green eyes, when she lifted her head to scan the empty stockade, burned with a defiance that all the chains in the world couldn't extinguish. Ridge counted the seconds, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of guards. The silence stretched on, broken only by the drip of moisture from the pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the canyon. The raiders were gone, probably moved on to fresh hunting grounds, leaving their prisoner to die. Slowly, of exposure and starvation, he slipped through the gap in the stockade wall, moving low and fast across the open ground. The woman's head snapped up at his approach, and for a moment terror replaced defiance in her eyes. She'd learned to fear the footsteps of men. "Easy," Ridge whispered, holding his hands where she could see them, his rifle slung across his back. "I'm not one of them. Name's Nathan Walker. I'm here to help." She stared at him for a long moment, taking in his weathered face, his mountain man's garb, the kindness in his brown eyes that 20 years of hard living hadn't managed to kill. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from thirst and screaming, but it carried the unmistakable accent of educated German immigrants. "Eliza May Carpenter," she said simply. "My father, I found him," Ridge said gently. "He told me about you before he passed, sent me to find you." Something broke in her face then, grief replacing defiance for just a moment, before she pulled herself together with visible effort. "How long have I been here?" "4 days by my count." Ridge examined the chain around her ankle. It was secured with a heavy padlock that would require either a key or some serious metalwork to remove. "Can you stand?" "I think so." She struggled to get her feet under her, and Ridge could see the toll her captivity had taken. She was dehydrated, exhausted, probably hadn't eaten in days. But when she stood, she did so with dignity intact. Ridge pulled out his hunting knife and began working on the rawhide binding her wrists. The leather had swollen with moisture and shrunk again, becoming hard as iron, but his blade was sharp. And he worked with practiced efficiency. "How many of them were there?" he asked as he worked. "8, she replied without hesitation, led by a man with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. They spoke some English, enough to taunt their prisoners. Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of experiences she wouldn't share with a stranger. The rawhide parted with a snap, and Ridge felt her wrists come free. Her hands were swollen and discolored from the tight bindings, but she flexed her fingers with determination that impressed him. This was not a woman who gave up easily. "The ankle chain is going to be more of a problem." Ridge examined the heavy links. "I don't have tools here that can break this. We'll need to find another way." "There might be keys," Eliza May said. "The one with the scar. He wore them on his belt, but they took everything when they left this morning." Ridge nodded, thinking. The chain was anchored to the post by a heavy ring driven deep into the wood. The post itself was solid, probably 2 feet thick and driven several feet into the ground, but the wood was old, and Ridge had noticed some rot near the base. "Stand back as far as the chain allows," he said, unsinging his rifle. "This is going to be loud." He aimed carefully at the base of the post, where the rot was most visible. The heavy .50 caliber mountain rifle boomed like thunder in the enclosed space, the echo bouncing off the canyon walls and rolling away. Into the distance, wood splinters flew and dust rose from the impact site, but the post held. Ridge reloaded quickly, his hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times under pressure. The second shot hit just above the first, and this time he heard the satisfying crack of wood giving way. "Help me," he said, grabbing the post and putting his shoulder against it. Together they pushed, and with a grinding, splintering sound, the post toppled over. The chain was still locked around Eliza May's ankle, but now she could move freely, dragging the length of chain behind her. "Can you travel?" Ridge asked, already knowing they needed to move quickly. The gunshots would carry for miles in this country, and anyone with ears would know exactly where they'd come from. "I can do whatever I need to do," she replied, and something in her tone told Ridge that she meant every word. He helped her gather what remained of her torn skirts, then led her toward the gap in the stockade wall. But as they reached the opening, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance, distant still, but getting closer. "They're coming back," Eliza, May said, and Ridge heard no fear in her voice, only grim determination. Ridge's mind raced through their options. The canyon had only one main entrance, and that was where the riders were coming from. There were game trails leading up the canyon walls, but they would be impossible to navigate quickly, especially with Eliza May weakened from her ordeal and dragging a chain. "This way," he said, leading her toward the back of the stockade, where the canyon wall rose almost vertically. "There's a cave about 50 feet up. It's not much, but it'll hide us until they leave again." They moved as quickly as Eliza May's condition would allow, the chain around her ankle clanking softly with each step. Ridge tried to muffle the sound by wrapping part of her torn skirt around the links, but he knew that anyone listening carefully would still hear it. The cave was little more than a crack in the rock face, barely wide enough for one person and perhaps 10 feet deep. Ridge had discovered it years ago while tracking a wounded bear, and it had saved his life more than once during mountain storms. Today, it might save both their lives. Getting Eliza May up the rocky face to the cave entrance was a challenge that tested both his strength and her determination. The chain made every movement awkward, and her weakened condition meant she had to rest frequently, but she never complained, never asked him to slow down, never suggested they find an easier way. By the time they reached the cave, the hoofbeats were echoing loudly off the canyon walls. Ridge pulled Eliza May into the narrow opening just as the first riders appeared at the stockade. From their hiding place, they could see down into the compound clearly. 8 warriors rode into the enclosure, their leader immediately visible by the livid scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline. When he saw the destroyed post and the empty chains, his roar of rage echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of an enraged bear. The warriors spread out, searching for tracks, examining the splintered post, arguing among themselves in their native tongue. Ridge didn't speak Crow, but he didn't need to understand the words to know they were debating whether to pursue immediately or gather more men first. Beside him in the cramped cave, Eliza May watched the searchers with calm eyes. She should have been terrified. These men had held her captive for days, done things to her that Ridge could only imagine. But instead of fear, he saw calculation in her expression, as if she were memorizing faces and planning her own form of justice. "The tall one with the feathers in his hair," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He was the worst of them, called himself Running Wolf in English. Said he'd make me his woman before they killed me." Ridge felt anger rise in his chest like a living thing. In his 20 years in the mountains, he'd seen plenty of violence, dealt out his share when necessary. But there was something about the casual cruelty of these rogue warriors that made him want to step out of the cave and settle accounts right now. But he was a mountain man, not a fool. 8 against 1 were odds that only a dead man would take. The search went on for 2 hours. The warriors examined every inch of the stockade, followed false trails in multiple directions, and generally made enough noise to wake the dead. But mountain men learned to hide where other men couldn't think to look, and the cave remained undiscovered. Finally, as the sun reached its peak overhead, the scarred leader made a decision. He barked orders to his men, who mounted their horses with obvious reluctance. Ridge could tell they wanted to continue the search, but their leader was calling the retreat. As they rode out of the canyon, the scarred man turned in his saddle and called out in heavily accented English, "We know you are here, mountain man. We will find you, and when we do, you will beg us to kill you quickly." "Ibi," his voice echoed off the canyon walls and faded into silence, leaving only the sound of wind through the pines and the distant cry of hunting birds. Ridge waited another hour before he moved, listening carefully for any sound that might indicate someone had been left behind to watch. Only when he was satisfied that they were truly alone did he help Eliza May down from the cave. "They'll be back," she said matter-of-factly as they made their way toward the canyon entrance. "With more men, probably. That one with the scar. He doesn't give up easily." "Neither do I," Ridge replied, and something in his voice made her look at him sharply. They made camp that night in a hidden grove 5 miles from Devil's Canyon, next to a stream that would provide fresh water and muffle the sounds of their presence. Ridge used his knife and a flat rock to work on the chain around Eliza May's ankle, slowly filing through one of the links. As he worked, she told him about the attack on her family's farm. Her mother had been visiting relatives in town, which probably saved her life. Her father had tried to fight, but 8 mounted warriors against one middle-aged farmer was no contest at all. They'd burned the farmhouse, killed the livestock, taken everything of value. "Why did they take you alive?" Ridge asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "Entertainment," she said simply. "They made that very clear. I was to be their prize until they tired of me. Then they'd sell me to Comancheros down south. Or just kill me if they couldn't. Find buyers." The matter-of-fact way she said it made Ridge's chest tighten with anger again, but there was something else in her voice, a cold fury that told him Eliza May Carpenter was planning her own brand of justice for the men who'd destroyed her family. The chain link finally parted with a sharp snap, and the heavy iron fell away from her ankle. Ridge examined the raw, angry skin underneath, already planning the poultices and treatments that would help it heal. "Thank you," she said quietly, and he heard a world of meaning in those 2 simple words. "You don't need to thank me for doing what any decent man would do," Ridge replied, cleaning his knife on a handful of grass. "You'd be surprised how few decent men there are in this country," she said, massaging her freed ankle, "especially ones willing to risk their lives for strangers." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness, and something large moved through the underbrush. Nearby, probably a deer heading to the stream for water. "What will you do now?" Ridge asked. "Your farm is gone. Your family?" "I'll rebuild," she said with quiet determination. "Maybe not the farm, maybe not in the same place, but I'll rebuild something, and I'll make sure those men pay for what they did." Ridge looked at her across the small fire he'd built in a depression that would hide most of the light. Eliza May Carpenter had been through hell, lost everything she'd worked for, suffered abuse that would have broken many people. But instead of despair or self-pity, he saw only resolve in her green eyes. "That's a dangerous road to walk," he said carefully. "So is letting animals like that run free to hurt other families," she replied. "Someone has to stop them, and it doesn't look like anyone else is planning to step up." Ridge stirred the fire with a stick, thinking about her words. He'd been a loner for 20 years, avoiding the complications that came with getting involved in other people's problems. But something about this woman, about the injustice of what had happened to her family, was making him reconsider that philosophy. "I know these mountains better than any white man alive," he said finally. "I know where those raiders will run to earth, what trails they'll use, where they'll make camp. If someone was planning to hunt them down, that knowledge might be useful." She looked at him steadily across the fire. "Are you offering to help?" "Me, Nathan Walker?" "I'm offering to think about it," he replied. "Those are 8 very dangerous men. Going after them would be a good way to end up very dead, very quickly." "Everything worth doing carries risks," she said, "and some things are worth dying for if necessary." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. In the distance, a coyote howled, and others answered from different directions. Ridge had heard that sound thousands of times in his mountain years, but tonight it seemed to carry a different message, a promise of hunts to come and blood to be spilled. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "We'll talk more in the morning. Right now you need rest more than you need revenge." "I'll sleep when my family's murderers are in the ground," she replied. But she did roll herself in the blanket he offered, using her torn skirt as a pillow. Ridge sat watch through the night, feeding the fire and listening to the forest sounds around them. But his mind wasn't on potential dangers or the normal concerns of wilderness survival. Instead, he found himself thinking about green eyes filled with determination, about the quiet strength of a woman who'd endured hell and emerged unbroken. And he found himself thinking about 8 rogue warriors who'd made the mistake of underestimating both Eliza May Carpenter and the mountain man who'd decided to help her. By morning, Nathan Ridge Walker had made his decision. The dawn came, cold and grey over the hidden valley where Ridge and Eliza May had made camp, painting the world in shades of iron and ash. Frost covered their blankets like scattered diamonds, and their breath formed small clouds in the crisp mountain air. Ridge had been awake for an hour already, studying the terrain around them and planning their next move. Eliza May stirred as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the pine canopy above. She sat up slowly, testing her freed ankle and wincing slightly at the soreness, but Ridge noticed that she made no complaint, simply began folding the blanket with methodical precision. "Sleep well?" Ridge asked, poking at the coals of their fire with a stick. "Well enough," she replied, though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. "I kept dreaming about my father. He was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't make out the words." Ridge nodded, understanding. The dead had a way of speaking to the living in dreams, especially when there were debts left unpaid and justice left undone. He'd heard his own father's voice more than once in the years after Comanche raiders had killed him. "We need to move soon," Ridge said, standing and shouldering his pack. "Those warriors will be organizing a proper search party. They'll want to reclaim their prize and settle accounts with whoever freed her." Eliza May stood and brushed dirt from her torn skirts. "Good, let them come. I have some settling to do myself." Ridge looked at her sharply. During the night, something had changed in her demeanor. The frightened captive was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. He recognized the transformation because he'd undergone it himself 20 years ago. The moment when survival stopped being enough and vengeance became necessary. They broke camp quickly and moved deeper into the mountains, following game trails that Ridge had learned during his decades in the wilderness. These were paths carved by elk and deer over countless seasons, invisible to most men, but clear as highways to someone who knew how to read the land. As they walked, Ridge began teaching Eliza May the basics of mountain survival. How to move quietly through underbrush, how to read wind direction and use it to mask scent, how to identify edible plants and safe water sources. She absorbed every lesson with fierce concentration, as if storing knowledge for a war she was already planning. "You're not just teaching me to survive," she observed after he showed her how to identify tracks in soft earth. "You're teaching me to hunt." "Maybe," Ridge replied. "Depends on what you plan to do with the knowledge. I plan to use it to track down 8 murderers and make them pay for what they did to my family." Ridge stopped walking and turned to face her. "Eliza May, I need you to understand something. These aren't farmers or townsmen you're talking about hunting. These are warriors who've been fighting and killing since they were boys. They know these mountains almost as well as I do, and they won't hesitate to torture you to death if they catch you again. And then I'll have to make sure they don't catch me," she said simply. "Nathan, I appreciate everything you've done for me. I truly do. But with or without your help, I'm going after those men. The only question is whether I'll have a chance of succeeding." Ridge studied her face, seeing the same implacable determination that had kept her sane during her captivity. This wasn't grief-talking or temporary madness brought on by trauma. This was a woman who had made a calculated decision to seek justice, regardless of the cost. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this smart. No rushing in with guns blazing, no heroic last stands. We hunt them the way wolves hunt elk, patient, methodical, picking them off one at a time until the pack is too weak to fight back." A smile crossed Eliza May's face, and Ridge was surprised by how cold it looked. "I was hoping you'd say that." They spent the morning tracking the raiding party's trail from Devil's Canyon. Ridge had expected them to head south toward Comanchero territory, where they could trade stolen goods and captives for weapons and whiskey. Instead, the tracks led northeast toward the high country, rough terrain that offered plenty of hiding places but little in the way of easy pickings. "They're not running," Ridge observed, kneeling beside a clear hoofprint in mud beside a mountain stream. "They're regrouping, probably planning to gather more men before they come looking for us." "How many more men?" Eliza May asked, studying. "The tracks with growing expertise? Hard to say. Could be a dozen, could be 50. Depends on how many other exiles and rogue warriors they can convince to join them." Ridge stood and brushed dirt from his knees. "But every man they recruit is another mouth to feed, another ego to manage. Large groups leave larger trails and make more noise." They followed the trail for 3 hours, moving carefully and stopping frequently to listen for sounds that didn't belong to the forest. Ridge had learned long ago that patience was the most important weapon in any hunter's arsenal. The trail led them to a narrow valley between two towering peaks, where a small lake fed by snowmelt provided fresh water and good grazing for horses. Ridge motioned for Eliza May to stay back while he scouted ahead, climbing a rocky outcrop that would give him a clear view of the valley floor. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The raiding party had indeed grown. Where 8 warriors had ridden out of Devil's Canyon, now at least 20 men were camped beside the lake. They'd constructed temporary shelters from pine boughs and buffalo hides, and smoke rose from several cooking fires. Horses grazed nearby, more than Ridge could count from his position, but it wasn't the increased numbers that worried him most. It was the discipline he observed in their camp layout, the organized way they'd posted sentries, the quality of their weapons and equipment. This wasn't a ragtag band of outlaws anymore. This was a war party led by someone who understood military tactics. Ridge slipped back down the rocks to where Eliza May waited in concealment. 20 men, maybe more, he reported quietly. Well organized, well armed. They're not just planning to hunt us down, they're planning something bigger. What do you mean? She asked. I mean, they've got enough men and firepower to hit a town, not just isolated farms. They're planning a major raid, and they want to eliminate any witnesses before they strike. Eliza May's face went pale. Copper Creek. The town, where my mother is staying with relatives. Ridge nodded grimly. 800 people, mostly farmers and shopkeepers, a few retired soldiers, maybe a sheriff's deputy or two. Against 20 mounted warriors, they wouldn't stand a chance. We have to warn them, Eliza May said, starting to rise. Hold on, Ridge grabbed her arm. Warning them won't be enough. By the time we reach town and convince anyone to take the threat seriously, these raiders could be burning down the main street. Then what do you suggest? Ridge was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. 20 against 2 were impossible odds in a direct confrontation. But mountain warfare wasn't about direct confrontation. It was about using terrain, weather, and the enemy's own weaknesses against them. We even the odds first, he said finally. Make them too busy worrying about their own survival to plan any raids. How? Ridge smiled grimly. By becoming their worst nightmare. We turn their numbers against them, make them paranoid and jumpy, pick off stragglers, sabotage their equipment, hit them when they least expect it, make them afraid to sleep at night. Eliza May nodded slowly. Guerrilla warfare. You know about military tactics. My father served in the Prussian army before he came to America. He told me stories about fighting Napoleon's forces in the German forests, said small groups of determined fighters could defeat much larger armies if they were smart about it. Ridge looked at her with new respect. Your father was a wise man. The principles are the same, whether you're fighting French soldiers or rogue warriors. They spent the rest of the day observing the enemy camp from concealment, learning the raiders' routines and identifying weaknesses. Ridge noted that they posted guards in shifts, but the sentries grew careless as the day wore on. Their horses were kept in a rope corral near the lake, guarded but not heavily. Most importantly, their leader, the scarred warrior, seemed to spend most of his time in a large shelter at the center of camp, emerging only to settle disputes or give orders. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As evening approached, Ridge and Eliza May withdrew to a hidden camp of their own, tucked into a cave system a mile from the lake. The caves provided shelter from wind and weather, while remaining invisible from outside. Tonight we begin, Ridge said as they prepared their equipment by flickering firelight. But I want you to understand something, Eliza May. Once we start this war, there's no going back. They'll hunt us to the ends of the earth, and they won't show mercy if they catch us. And they already showed me their mercy, she replied, checking the loads in the pistol he'd given her. I have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Ridge nodded and began blackening his face with charcoal from the fire. First rule of mountain warfare: never attack where they expect you to. We're not going after their sentries or their weapons. We're going after their horses. Why the horses? Because without horses, 20 warriors become 20 men on foot in hostile territory. They'll be slower, more vulnerable, easier to track. And a warrior without his horse is like a wolf without its pack, dangerous still but not nearly as confident. They left the cave at midnight, moving through the forest like ghosts. Ridge had spent years learning to walk silently through underbrush, and he passed his knowledge to Eliza May through whispered instructions and hand signals. She proved to be a quick learner, her hatred providing motivation that formal training couldn't match. The raider camp was quiet except for the occasional snore from sleeping warriors and the soft nickering of horses in their corral. 2 guards sat by the dying embers of a cooking fire, but they were more interested in passing a bottle of whiskey between them than watching for intruders. Ridge and Eliza May approached the horse corral from the blind side, using the lakeshore to muffle their footsteps. The animals sensed their presence but remained calm. Ridge had always had a way with horses, and these had been stolen from farms where they'd learned to trust humans. Working quickly and silently, they cut the rope corral in several places, creating gaps that would allow the horses to scatter when startled. Ridge had brought a small bag of black powder from his supplies, and he used it to create a crude explosive device with a long fuse. When this goes off, the horses will bolt, he whispered to Eliza May. We'll be long gone by then, but the confusion will give us cover to make our escape. They retreated to a safe distance and lit the fuse, then settled in to watch the results. The explosion, when it came, was smaller than Ridge had hoped, but loud enough to wake the dead. Horses screamed and bolted in all directions, their hoofbeats thundering across the valley floor. Warriors scrambled from their shelters, shouting questions and contradictory orders. In the chaos that followed, Ridge counted at least 15 horses running free across the valley, disappearing into the darkness beyond the camp's firelight. The raiders would spend hours trying to recapture them, and some would never be caught in this rough terrain. Phase 1 complete, Ridge whispered to Eliza May as they slipped away into the forest. Now they know they're being hunted. The next morning brought angry voices echoing across the valley as the raiders discovered the full extent of their losses. Ridge and Eliza May watched from concealment as search parties spread out in all directions, looking for tracks and signs of their attackers. But Ridge had chosen their escape route carefully, leading across rocky ground that would hold no prints, and through streams that would wash away their scent. "They're angry," Eliza May observed, watching warriors argue and gesture wildly around their diminished horse herd. "Angry men make mistakes," Ridge replied, "and mistakes get people killed." Indeed, the raiders' response was exactly what Ridge had hoped for. Instead of posting better guards and improving their defenses, they sent out hunting parties to scour the surrounding area. This divided their forces and gave Ridge and Eliza May multiple opportunities to strike. That afternoon, they ambushed a three-man patrol that had ventured too far from the main camp. Ridge's rifle spoke once from concealment, dropping the lead warrior from his horse. The other two scattered, but Eliza May was waiting in their path with her pistol ready. She didn't hesitate when the moment came. Her shot took the second warrior in the chest, sending him tumbling from his mount. The third warrior escaped, but his horse had been hit and wouldn't carry him far. More importantly, he carried word back to the main camp that their enemies were armed, dangerous, and completely ruthless. "Two down," Eliza May said matter-of-factly as they stripped the dead warriors of useful equipment. 18 to go. Ridge looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. She showed no remorse about the killing, no hesitation about taking lives. The woman who had been a farmer's daughter just days ago was becoming something harder and more dangerous. "How do you feel?" he asked as they moved to a new hiding place. "Like I'm finally fighting back," she replied. "Like my father and all the other innocent people they've killed are getting some justice at last." That night, they struck again. This time, they targeted the raiders' water supply, poisoning the lake with a mixture of bitter herbs that would cause severe stomach cramps without being immediately fatal. Ridge wanted the warriors sick and weakened, not dead from this particular attack. The results were evident the next morning when barely half the remaining raiders were able to stand upright, let alone fight. The rest lay groaning in their shelters, too ill to do anything but curse their mysterious enemies. "Poison?" The scarred leader's voice carried clearly across the valley as he raged at his remaining healthy warriors. "Cowards, face us like men." Ridge smiled grimly at the accusation. He's getting desperate. Desperate men do stupid things, and stupid things were exactly what the scarred leader began doing. Instead of withdrawing to a more defensible position or sending for reinforcements, he divided his remaining healthy warriors into even smaller groups, ordering them to search every cave, every trail, every possible hiding place in the surrounding mountains. This gave Ridge and Eliza May exactly the opportunities they needed. Over the next 3 days, they picked off stragglers and isolated pairs of searchers with methodical precision. Ridge's rifle and Eliza May's growing skill with pistol and knife reduced the raiding party by half. By the end of the week, only 8 warriors remained of the original 20, and most of those were either wounded or still recovering from the poisoned water. The scarred leader had stopped sending out patrols entirely, instead ordering his remaining men to fortify their camp and wait for help that might never come. "We've got them trapped," Eliza May said, as they watched the diminished camp from their latest observation post. "Now what?" "Now we finish it," Ridge replied, "but not here and not on their terms. We're going to make them come to us, on ground of our choosing." "How?" Ridge smiled, and Eliza May was struck by how predatory the expression looked. "By giving them something they want more than safety, something worth risking their lives for." "What's that?" "You," Ridge said simply. "We're going to use you as bait." Eliza May's eyes flashed with anger, but before she could protest, Ridge continued, "Not as a helpless captive this time, as a hunter who looks like prey. Until the moment she springs the trap." Understanding dawned in her green eyes. and her anger transformed into something that looked very much like anticipation. "Tell me more," she said. The abandoned silver mine at Eagle's Rest had been carved into the mountainside, 30E, years ago by prospectors who dreamed of striking it rich in the Colorado Territory. Now it stood empty, its wooden supports weathered grey and its entrance yawning like a mouth full of broken teeth. Ridge had discovered it during his second year in the mountains, and he'd used it as a winter shelter more than once when the snows came early and deep. "This is where we make our stand," Ridge said, gesturing toward the mine entrance as he and Eliza May approached through the morning shadows. "3 ways in, but only 1 way out unless you know the back tunnels. Perfect for a trap." Eliza May studied the terrain with the tactical eye she'd developed over the past week of guerrilla warfare. The mine sat on a natural shelf of rock about halfway up the mountain, accessible by a narrow trail that switchbacked up the slope. Anyone approaching would be exposed and vulnerable, while defenders in the mine would have excellent fields of fire. "You said 3 ways in?" she asked. "Main entrance here, ventilation shaft about 50 yards up the slope, and an old access tunnel on the south side that most people don't know about." Ridge shouldered his pack and started toward the mine, but the back tunnels connect to natural caves that exit on the other side of the mountain. Emergency escape route if things go wrong. They spent the morning preparing their fortress, moving supplies into the mine and setting up defensive positions. Ridge showed Eliza May how to construct shooting blinds from loose rocks and timber, creating concealed positions that would allow them to fire on attackers while remaining protected themselves. The mine shaft extended deep into the mountain, its main tunnel branching into several smaller passages that the prospectors had dug while chasing veins of silver ore. Ridge led Eliza May through the maze of tunnels, showing her the layout and marking escape routes with pieces of torn cloth. "If we get separated during the fight, follow the white markers," he instructed, tying a strip of fabric to a support beam. "They'll lead you to the back exit. Don't try to be a hero. If things go bad, you run and don't look back." "I'm not running anywhere," Eliza May said firmly. "Those men killed my father and destroyed my family. I'm going to look them in the eyes when they die." Ridge studied her face in the flickering light of their pine torch. Over the past week, he'd watched her transform from a traumatized captive into something harder and more dangerous. She moved with a predator's grace now, handled weapons with practiced efficiency, and showed no hesitation about killing when necessary. But he wondered if she understood the psychological toll that this kind of warfare would eventually extract. "Revenge is a fire that burns both ways, Eliza May," he said quietly. "Make sure it doesn't consume you in the process. I'll worry about my soul after my father's murderers are in the ground," she replied, checking the loads in her pistols. "Right now, I'm more concerned with making sure they join him." By midday, their preparations were complete. They'd constructed firing positions commanding all approaches to the mine, stockpiled ammunition and supplies, and established fallback positions deeper in the tunnels. Now came the hardest part: waiting for their enemies to take the bait. Ridge climbed to a lookout position on the ridge above the mine, where he could observe the valley below through his spyglass. The remaining raiders were still camped by the lake, but their behavior had changed markedly over the past few days. Instead of the confident aggression they'd displayed initially, they now moved with the paranoid caution of men who knew they were being hunted. "They're scared," Eliza May observed, joining him at the observation post. "Good. Scared animals are the most dangerous kind," Ridge replied, adjusting his spyglass. "They'll fight twice as hard when they're cornered." They settled in to wait, taking turns at the observation post and the defensive positions in the mine. Ridge used the time to continue Eliza May's education in mountain warfare, teaching her how to read terrain, predict enemy movements, and coordinate defensive fire. She absorbed every lesson with fierce concentration, as if her life depended on remembering every detail, which Ridge reflected it probably did. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Ridge spotted movement in the valley below. 3 riders had emerged from the raider camp and were making their way up the mountain trail toward Eagle's Rest. Even at this distance, he could make out the distinctive scar that marked their leader. "Here they come," he called softly to Eliza May. 3 riders, probably a scouting party. She joined him at the observation post, studying the approaching riders through the spyglass. "The scarred one is with them. He's not taking any chances this time." "Good," Ridge said, checking his rifle. "Time to spring the first part of our trap." They'd planned this moment carefully. Instead of hiding and letting the scouts discover the mine on their own, they would present Eliza May as an apparently helpless target, drawing the raiders into a hasty attack on ground of their choosing. Eliza May took her position at the mine entrance, where she would be clearly visible to the approaching scouts. She'd torn her clothing to look more desperate and disheveled, and Ridge had used berry juice to simulate fresh blood on her face and hands. To casual observation, she would appear to be an exhausted fugitive who had taken shelter in the mine. Ridge positioned himself in a concealed shooting blind 50 yards up the slope, where his rifle would command the trail leading to the mine. If everything went according to plan, the scouts would see what appeared to be an easy target and rush in. Without proper reconnaissance, the 3 riders approached cautiously, their horses picking their way carefully up the rocky trail. Ridge could see them scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of ambush, but their attention was focused on the obvious danger zones, the high ground directly above the trail and the rock formations that could conceal riflemen. They weren't expecting the real threat to come from a shooting blind positioned to their flank. The scarred leader raised his hand, bringing the small column to a halt about 100 yards from the mine entrance. Ridge watched through his rifle sights as the man studied Eliza May's apparently helpless figure, clearly debating whether this was a trap or an opportunity. The debate didn't last long. Greed and the desire for revenge overcame caution, and the scarred warrior spurred his horse forward, his 2 companions following close behind. They made it halfway to the mine entrance before Ridge opened fire. His first shot took the trailing rider in the chest, knocking him backward off his horse with a strangled cry. The heavy .50 caliber ball punched through the warrior's leather shirt and ribs, dropping him dead in the trail. The scarred leader wheeled his horse around, trying to locate the source of the shot, but Ridge was already reloading with practiced speed. The second warrior tried to charge the mine entrance, apparently believing that Eliza May was unarmed and helpless. He learned otherwise when she stepped out from behind a rock formation with both pistols blazing. Her first shot missed, but the second caught the charging warrior in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle. He managed to stay mounted, but his charge faltered as he struggled to control his wounded arm and his panicked horse. The scarred leader spotted Ridge's muzzle flash and sent his horse scrambling up the slope toward the shooting blind, a war axe glinting in his hand. Ridge's second shot went wide as his target weaved between the rocks, closing the distance with frightening speed. Ridge abandoned his rifle and drew his knife just as the scarred warrior reached his position. The man leaped from his horses, back with a wild cry, axe raised high overhead. The 2 men crashed together in a tangle of limbs and steel, rolling down the rocky slope in a desperate struggle for survival. The warrior was younger and possibly stronger, but Ridge had 20 years of mountain fighting experience and the cold fury of a man defending someone he'd come to care about. They separated after rolling 20 feet down the slope, both men, bloodied, but still fighting. The scarred warrior swung his axe in a vicious arc that would have split Ridge's skull if it had connected, but the mountain man ducked under the blow and drove his knife toward his opponent's ribs. The warrior twisted aside, and Ridge's blade scraped along his leather vest instead of finding flesh. The man's return stroke with the axe handle caught Ridge across the temple, sending stars exploding across his vision. Below them at the mine entrance, Eliza May was engaged in her own desperate battle. The wounded warrior had dismounted and was advancing on her position with a tomahawk, blood streaming from his shoulder wound, but determination written across his face. She fired her remaining loaded pistol, but the shot went high, chipping rock above the warrior's head. He covered the remaining distance in a rush, swinging his tomahawk in a deadly arc. Eliza May dove aside, the steel head of the weapon passing inches from her skull. She rolled behind a pile of mining debris, frantically trying to reload one of her pistols, while her attacker circled around to find a clear shot at her. On the slope above, Ridge and the scarred leader continued their deadly dance. The warrior's axe blade bit deep into a wooden mine support where Ridge's head had been a split second earlier. Ridge grabbed a handful of loose gravel and threw it in his opponent's face, then lunged forward with his knife. This time, his blade found its mark, sliding between the warrior's ribs to pierce his lung. The scarred man gasped and staggered backward, but he wasn't finished fighting. His axe came around in a backhand swing that caught Ridge across the ribs, tearing through his buckskin shirt and opening a long gash in his side. Ridge felt the hot rush of blood and knew he couldn't sustain this kind of damage much longer. He feinted left, then dove right, tackling his opponent around the waist and driving both of them to the ground. They rolled again, each man trying to bring his weapon to bear, but the close quarters made it impossible to use either knife or axe effectively. It became a wrestling match, with both men straining for position and leverage. The scarred warrior was weakening from his lung wound, blood frothing from his mouth with each labored breath. But he managed to get his hands around Ridge's throat, powerful fingers crushing down on the mountain man's windpipe. Ridge's vision began to darken as his air supply was cut off. In desperation, he drove his knee up into his opponent's wounded ribs, eliciting a scream of agony that loosened the death grip on his throat. He followed up with his knife, driving the blade deep into the warrior's chest. The scarred man's eyes went wide with shock and pain, then slowly glazed over as life left his body. Ridge pushed the corpse aside and struggled to his feet, gasping for air and trying to stop the bleeding from his side. Below him, he could hear the sounds of continuing combat as Eliza May fought for her life. The wounded warrior had cornered her behind the mining debris, and she was down to using rocks and pieces of broken timber to keep him at bay. Her pistols were empty, and she hadn't had time to reload. Ridge retrieved his rifle and loaded it with shaking hands, his vision blurred by blood loss and exhaustion. The wounded warrior was raising his tomahawk for a killing blow when Ridge's shot echoed across the mountainside. The heavy ball caught the warrior in the back, driving him forward into the pile of debris. He fell across the wooden beams and lay still, his tomahawk clattering harmlessly onto the rocks. Eliza May emerged from behind the debris pile, her dress torn and her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but alive and unharmed. She looked up, the slope to where Ridge was standing, swaying slightly from blood loss. "Are you hurt?" she called. "I'll live," Ridge replied, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. The gash in his side was deep and bleeding freely, and he was beginning to feel lightheaded from the loss of blood. Eliza May climbed up to his position and immediately began examining his wound. "This needs to be cleaned and stitched," she said with the practical authority of someone who'd grown up on a frontier farm. "And you've lost more blood than you can afford." She helped him back to the mine entrance where their medical supplies were stored. As she worked to clean and bandage his wound, Ridge kept watch on the valley below through his spyglass. "The rest of them will have heard the shooting," he said through gritted teeth as Eliza May's needle bit into his skin. "They'll be coming soon, and in force. How many do you think are left?" 5, maybe 6, but they'll be desperate now, and desperate men fight harder than confident ones. Ridge accepted the bottle of whiskey she offered and took a long pull to dull the pain. We hurt them today, but we also showed them exactly where we are. As if summoned by his words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed up from the valley below. Ridge trained his spyglass on the trail and counted 5 riders approaching at a gallop, their weapons glinting in the late afternoon sun. "Here they come," he said, struggling to his feet despite Eliza May's protests. "No more games, no more traps. This time they're coming for blood." The final battle was about to begin. Ridge and Eliza May took their positions in the mine entrance, rifles loaded and spare weapons within easy reach. The approaching riders had spread out into a skirmish line, making themselves harder targets while maximizing their firepower. "Remember what I taught you about defensive shooting," Ridge said quietly. "Pick your targets, make every shot count, and don't let them get close enough to use those tomahawks." "I remember," Eliza May replied, her voice steady despite the desperate nature of their situation. "Nathan, yeah? Whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm grateful, not just for saving me, but for giving me the chance to fight back." Ridge looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd transformed from victim to warrior in the space of a week. "It's been my honor, Eliza May. Your father would be proud." The riders were within rifle range now, urging their horses up the steep trail toward the mine entrance. Ridge could see the determination in their faces, the desperate fury of men who knew this was their last chance for revenge. "Here we go," he whispered, settling the stock of his rifle against his shoulder and taking careful aim at the lead rider. The shot that followed would echo across the mountains like thunder, marking the beginning of the most desperate fight of either of their lives. And in that moment, as powder smoke began to fill the air and war cries echoed off the canyon walls, Ridge realized that he would gladly die beside this woman if that's what honor demanded. The final act of their mountain war was about to unfold. Ridge's rifle cracked like thunder across the mountainside, and the lead rider pitched sideways from his horse, tumbling down the rocky slope in a spray of blood and dust. The remaining 4 warriors split apart instantly, 2 veering left toward the ventilation shaft, while the other 2 charged straight up the main trail toward the mine entrance. Eliza May's rifle spoke a heartbeat later, her shot catching one of the flanking riders in the leg. The wounded warrior managed to stay mounted, but his horse stumbled on the loose rocks, slowing their advance and buying precious seconds. "They're trying to split our fire!" Ridge shouted over the sound of war cries and pounding hooves. He was already reloading, his practiced hands working despite the blood seeping through his bandages. "Take the ones going for the shaft. I'll handle the frontal assault." The 2 warriors charging the main entrance were less than 50 yards away now, leaning low over their horses' necks to present smaller targets. Ridge could see the painted war designs on their faces, could hear their battle songs rising above the thunder of hoofbeats on stone. His second shot went wide as one of the horses stumbled, throwing off his aim. The warriors were almost on. Top of the mine entrance now, close enough that Ridge could see the fury blazing in their eyes. He dropped his rifle and drew both pistols, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether he and Eliza May lived or died. The first warrior vaulted from his horse's back while the animal was still moving, landing in a crouch with a war axe in each hand. He was young, maybe 20, with the lean build and quick reflexes of someone who'd been fighting since childhood. Ridge's first pistol shot missed by inches, the ball chipping sparks from the rock wall behind the warrior's head. The young warrior closed the distance in 3 quick strides, his axes weaving a deadly pattern through the air. Ridge barely managed to duck under the first swing, feeling the steel blade part the air where his skull had been. He brought his second pistol up, but the warrior was already inside his guard, one axe sweeping toward Ridge's ribs. Ridge twisted desperately, the axe blade slicing through his buckskin shirt and opening a shallow cut across his chest. He grabbed the warrior's wrist with his free hand, struggling to control the weapon while trying to bring his pistol to bear. Meanwhile, Eliza May was fighting her own desperate battle 50 yards up the slope. The two warriors, who had circled toward the ventilation shaft, had dismounted and were working their way through the rocks toward her position. She'd wounded one of them, but that only seemed to make him more dangerous. Her rifle was empty, and there hadn't been time to reload before they closed with her. She'd drawn her pistols, but the rocky terrain made accurate shooting difficult, and these warriors were using every bit of available cover. A painted face appeared over a boulder. 20 feet away, and Eliza May snapped off a quick shot that sent rock chips flying. The warrior ducked back, but she could hear him moving, circling around to get behind her position. The second warrior chose that moment to rush her from the front, counting on his partner's flanking maneuver to divide her attention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Eliza May's pistol boomed, and the charging warrior spun sideways, clutching his shoulder. But he didn't go down, and he was still coming. At the mine entrance, Ridge was locked in a deadly wrestling match with the young warrior. They'd both lost, their weapons in the struggle, and now it was a contest of strength, skill, and sheer determination. The warrior was younger and faster, but Ridge had 20 years of mountain fighting experience and the desperate strength of a man protecting someone he cared about. They crashed into the wooden supports at the mine entrance, sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. Ridge drove his knee into the warrior's midsection, doubling him over, then brought his elbow down between the man's shoulder blades. The warrior rolled aside and came up with a knife that had fallen from Ridge's belt during the struggle. Steel flashed in the afternoon light as the blade swept toward Ridge's throat. Ridge caught the warrior's wrist just in time, the knife point stopping inches from his jugular. For a moment they strained against each other, muscles trembling. With effort, neither man able to gain the advantage. Then the second warrior from the frontal assault appeared in the mine entrance, having dismounted from his horse. This one was older, more experienced, and he carried a rifle that was already trained on Ridge's back. "Nathan!" Eliza May's warning cry echoed off the canyon walls. Ridge released his grip on the young warrior's wrist and threw himself sideways just as the rifle cracked. The ball meant for his spine instead caught the young warrior in the chest, dropping him to the ground in a spreading pool of blood. The older warrior cursed in his native tongue and began reloading, but Ridge was already moving. He scooped up his dropped pistol and put a ball through the man's heart before he could ram home a fresh charge. Up the slope, Eliza May was in serious trouble. The wounded warrior had managed to work his way behind her position while his partner kept her pinned down with rifle fire. She could hear him moving through the rocks, getting closer with each passing second. She spun around just as he appeared, tomahawk raised for a killing blow. Her pistol was empty, but she still had one loaded weapon left. The derringer that Ridge had given her as a last resort was small and had limited range, but at point-blank distance it would be devastating. The warrior's tomahawk was already descending when she pulled the trigger. The tiny pistol bucked in her hand, and the .41 caliber ball punched through the warrior's chest, stopping his heart instantly. He toppled backward, his weapon clattering harmlessly among the rocks. That left one enemy still alive, the warrior with the rifle who'd been providing covering fire. Eliza May could see him moving among the boulders, trying to get a clear shot at her position. Her weapons were all empty now, and there was no time to reload. Ridge appeared at her side, having climbed the slope despite his wounds. He was bleeding from multiple cuts, and his face was pale from blood loss, but his rifle was loaded and ready. "Where is he?" Ridge whispered. "Behind that big boulder, about 30 yards northwest," Eliza May replied. "He's got a rifle and he's been shooting at anything that moves." Ridge studied the terrain, looking for an angle that would give him a clear shot. The warrior had chosen his position well, with solid rock protection and multiple escape routes. A frontal assault would be suicide, and they didn't have time for a prolonged siege. "I'm going to circle around behind him," Ridge said. "Keep him busy. Make him think you're still here." "You're in no condition to go anywhere," Eliza May protested. "You've lost too much blood already." "I'll manage." Ridge checked his rifle one more time. "Just give me 5 minutes to get into position." He disappeared into the rocks, moving with the silent grace that had kept him alive for 20 years in hostile territory. Eliza May watched him go with growing concern. His movements weren't as fluid as usual, and she could see him favoring his wounded side. She began reloading her weapons, working as quietly as possible while keeping watch for any sign of the remaining warrior. The silence stretched on, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant cry of a circling hawk. A rifle shot echoed from somewhere behind the boulder where the warrior was hiding, followed by a grunt of pain and the sound of a body falling. Ridge's voice called out a moment later, "It's over, he's down." Eliza May made her way carefully through the rocks to where Ridge stood over the body of the last warrior. He was swaying on his feet, his face ashen, and fresh blood was seeping through his bandages. "That's all of them," she said, looking around at the scattered bodies of their enemies. "All of this group anyway," Ridge replied, leaning heavily against a boulder. "But where there's one war party, there might be others. We need to get away from here before more show up." Eliza May helped him back down the slope to the mine entrance, where their supplies were cached. She could see that he was struggling to stay conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. "You need medical attention," she said, examining his wounds. "Real medical attention, not just field dressing. Nearest doctor is in Copper Creek," Ridge said. "That's a 2-day ride in good conditions, longer if we have to avoid pursuit. Then that's where we're going." Eliza May began gathering their essential supplies, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry. "Can you ride?" "I can do whatever I have to do," Ridge replied, echoing her own words from days earlier. They caught 2 of the raiders' horses that had wandered back toward the mine after their riders were killed. The animals were well-trained war ponies, accustomed to gunfire and violence, and they seemed calm enough despite the carnage around them. As they prepared to leave Eagle's Rest, Eliza May took one last look at the battlefield where they'd made their stand. 8 warriors lay dead among the rocks, their blood already drawing flies in the afternoon heat. It was a grim sight, but she felt no regret. "My father can rest easier now," she said quietly. Ridge nodded, understanding. "Justice has been served, but the cost was high." "Freedom always costs blood," Eliza May replied. "The only question is, whose blood gets spilled?" They rode out as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, heading northeast toward Copper Creek and whatever future awaited them there. Ridge swayed in his saddle, fighting to stay conscious, while Eliza May rode beside him, ready to catch him if he fell. The trail wound through dense forest and across rushing streams, following paths that Ridge had traveled many times during his years in the mountains. But this journey felt different somehow, as if they were leaving one life behind and riding toward another. "Nathan," Eliza May said, as they paused to rest the horses beside a clear mountain stream. "What will you do now? The war is over. Your mountain solitude is broken." Ridge considered the question while their horses drank from the stream. For 20 years, he'd lived alone in the wilderness, avoiding human contact and the complications that came with it. But the past week had changed something fundamental in him. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time in 20 years, I honestly don't know what comes next." "You could come to town with me," Eliza May suggested. "Help me rebuild what was lost. Start something new." "Town living isn't for me," Ridge replied. "Too many people, too many rules, too much noise." Well, then maybe I could stay out here, she said. Learn to live in the mountains the way you do. There's nothing left for me in civilization anyway. Ridge looked at her with surprise. Mountain life is hard, Eliza May, especially for a woman. Alone. Winters are brutal, supplies are scarce, and danger is always just around the next bend. I've been through worse, she reminded him, and I wouldn't be alone if you were there to teach me. The idea was tempting, more tempting than Ridge wanted to admit. Over the past week, he'd come to respect Eliza May's courage, her intelligence, her fierce determination. She'd proven herself as a warrior and a survivor, and he found himself drawn to her strength, but he also knew the harsh realities of mountain life, especially for someone who hadn't been born to it. The isolation could drive people mad. The constant danger could break even strong spirits, and the winter cold could kill the unprepared. Let's get you to town first, he said finally. Get proper medical care for both of us. Let you reconnect with your mother and what's left of your family. Then we can talk about the future. They remounted and continued their journey, the horses picking their way carefully along the narrow mountain trails. Ridge's condition was deteriorating steadily. He was having trouble staying upright in the saddle, and his face had taken on a grey pallor that worried Eliza May greatly. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered grove beside another stream. Eliza May helped Ridge down from his horse and immediately began examining his wounds. What she found made her stomach clench with fear. The bleeding has started again, she said, looking at the fresh blood seeping through his bandages, and I think infection is setting in. Ridge nodded weakly. Mountain fever. Seen it before. In men with deep wounds. He met her eyes with difficulty. Eliza May, you need to know something. If I don't make it to town— Don't talk like that, she interrupted. You're going to make it. We both are. Listen to me, Ridge insisted. If something happens to me, you take my horse and my weapons and you ride straight to Copper Creek. Don't try to bury me. Don't waste time on sentiment. Just go. Nathan, promise me, he said urgently. Promise me you won't throw your life away trying to save mine. Eliza May was quiet for a long moment, watching his face. In the flickering firelight, finally she nodded reluctantly. I promise, she said, but it won't come to that. I won't let it. Ridge smiled weakly. You're a remarkable woman, Eliza May Carpenter. Your father raised you right. She built up the fire and prepared a bed of pine boughs for him, then sat watch through the night while he drifted in and out of fevered sleep. His breathing was labored, and he muttered incoherently about old battles and long-dead friends. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eliza May made a decision that would change both their lives, forever. She wasn't going to let Nathan Walker die in these mountains, no matter what it cost her. He'd saved her life, given her the tools for revenge, and shown her a strength she never knew she possessed. Now it was her turn to save him. Hold on, Nathan, she whispered as she helped him back onto his horse. Just hold on a little longer. The race to Copper Creek had begun. Copper Creek sprawled along the banks of its namesake waterway like a collection of wooden boxes thrown carelessly across the valley floor. The town had grown quickly during the mining boom of the 1860s, and it still bore the rough, unfinished look of a settlement that had been built for profit rather than permanence. False-fronted buildings lined the main street, their paint already peeling after just a few years of mountain weather. Eliza May guided both horses down the muddy main thoroughfare. Ridge slumped unconscious in his saddle beside her. She'd managed to keep him upright during the 18-hour ride from their mountain camp, but his condition had deteriorated steadily. His skin burned with fever, and he'd been delirious for the last 6 hours, mumbling about battles fought long ago and comrades who existed only in memory. The townspeople they passed on the street stopped to stare at the strange procession. Eliza May knew what they saw. a woman in torn, blood-stained clothing leading a half-dead mountain man through their respectable community. Whispers followed in their wake, and she could feel the weight of their judgment like a physical thing. Dr. Samuel Morrison's office occupied the ground floor of a two-story building near the center of town. Eliza May had never met the man, but her father had spoken of him with respect during their rare trips to town for supplies. Morrison was said to be skilled with both bullet wounds and mountain fever, having served as a battlefield surgeon during the war. She tied the horses to the hitching post outside the doctor's office and somehow managed to get Ridge's unconscious form down from the saddle. He was heavier than he looked, all muscle and bone hardened by years of mountain living, and her own exhaustion made the task nearly impossible. "Help me," she called to a group of men standing outside the neighboring saloon. "This man needs a doctor." The men exchanged glances, taking in her appearance and Ridge's mountain man garb. One of them, a well-dressed man with the soft hands of a merchant, shook his head. "Looks like he's been in some kind of fight, miss. Could be trouble following him. Maybe you should take him somewhere else." "He's dying," Eliza May said flatly. "Are you going to help me save a man's life, or are you going to stand there like cowards?" The harsh words stung, as she'd intended them to. Two of the men stepped forward reluctantly and helped her carry Ridge into the doctor's office. They deposited him on the examination table and left quickly, as if they feared contamination from whatever violence had brought him to this state. Dr. Morrison was a thin man in his 50s, with prematurely grey hair and the steady hands of someone who'd spent years digging bullets out of wounded soldiers. He took one look at Ridge's condition and immediately began cutting away the blood-soaked bandages. "Knife wounds, rifle ball graze, and what looks like severe blood loss," he muttered as he worked. "How long has he been like this?" "The fever started yesterday," Eliza May replied, hovering anxiously beside the table. "The wounds are from the day before. I did what I could, but—" "You did fine work, considering," Morrison said, examining her field dressing. "These sutures probably saved his life. Where did you learn to sew wounds like this?" "My father. He served in the Prussian army before coming to America." Eliza May watched the doctor work, noting his professional competence. "Will he live?" "Hard to say. The infection has taken hold, and he's lost a dangerous amount of blood, but he's strong and mountain men are tough as old leather." Morrison began cleaning the wounds with whiskey. What happened to him? Eliza May hesitated. The truth was complicated and dangerous, involving murder, kidnapping, and a week-long guerrilla war that had left 8 men dead. She doubted the good people of Copper Creek would understand or approve. "Indian raiders," she said finally, which was true enough. "They attacked my family's farm, killed my father, took me captive. Nathan tracked them down and freed me." Morrison paused, in his work to look at her more carefully. "You're Thomas Carpenter's daughter. I heard about the attack. Your mother's been beside herself with worry." "My mother is here." Eliza May felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. She hadn't seen her mother in over 2 weeks, and she dreaded having to explain what had happened, staying with the Hendersons on Maple Street. She organized search parties, offered rewards, drove the sheriff half-crazy demanding action. Morrison returned to his patient. "She'll be overjoyed to see you alive." But would she be overjoyed to see what her daughter had become? Eliza May looked down at her hands, still stained with gunpowder and blood from the battles in the mountains. She'd killed men, fought like a warrior, lived by violence for over a week. That wasn't the gentle farm girl her mother had raised. The office door opened, and Sheriff William Garrett entered without knocking. He was a big man with a star on his vest, and the kind of swagger that came from never having been seriously challenged. His eyes took in Ridge's unconscious form and Eliza May's disheveled appearance. "Miss Carpenter," he said with forced politeness, We heard you were back in town. There are some questions that need answering." My friend is dying," Eliza May replied coldly. "Your questions can wait." "I'm afraid they can't." Garrett stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "This man has been identified as Nathan Walker, also known as Ridge. He's wanted for questioning in connection with several violent incidents in the territory." Dr. Morrison looked up from his work. "Sheriff, this man is in no condition to answer questions. He needs medical attention, not an interrogation." "He needs to answer for his crimes," Garrett replied. "Miss Carpenter, you've been missing for over a week. Where have you been, and what's your relationship to this mountain man?" Eliza May felt anger rising in her chest like a living thing. Here was Nathan Walker, the man who'd saved her life and helped her avenge her father's murder. Lying unconscious and dying, and this fool of a sheriff wanted to treat him like a criminal. "He saved my life," she said, her voice carrying the steel that had developed during her week of warfare. "The raiders who killed my father took me prisoner. Nathan found me, freed me, and helped me survive in the mountains while we tracked down my family's murderers." "Vigilante justice is still justice, Miss Carpenter," Garrett said pompously. "The law doesn't allow people to take matters into their own hands, regardless of the circumstances." "The law wasn't there when my father was murdered," Eliza May shot back. "The law wasn't there when I was chained like an animal and left to die. The law was sitting in this town, safe and comfortable, while good people were being butchered." The sheriff's face flushed with anger. "That's enough. You'll come with me for questioning, and your friend here will be placed under arrest as soon as he's conscious." "Like hell he will," Eliza May said, stepping between Garrett and the examination table. Her hand moved instinctively toward the pistol she still wore on her hip. The movement wasn't lost on the sheriff, whose own hand tightened on his weapon. "Miss Carpenter, I'm warning you. Don't make this situation worse than it already is." "Gentlemen." "Please," Dr. Morrison interjected. "This is a place of healing, not confrontation. Sheriff, I need at least 24 hours to stabilize my patient. Whatever legal issues you have can wait that long." Before Garrett could respond, the office door burst open again. A small, grey-haired woman rushed in, her face streaked with tears of joy and relief. "Eliza May!" Martha Carpenter threw her arms around her daughter, holding her tight as if she might disappear again. "Oh, my darling girl, I thought you were dead. When they told me about the farm, about your father—" I'm all right, Mama," Eliza May said, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't all right, and she doubted she ever would be again. The woman her mother was embracing was not the same person who'd been taken from the burning farmhouse 2 weeks ago. Martha Carpenter pulled back to look at her daughter, and Eliza May saw the moment when her mother noticed the changes. The hardness in her eyes, the way she held herself, the weapons she carried, the bloodstains on her clothes. "What happened to you?" Martha whispered. "What did they do?" "They made me stronger," Eliza May replied, and something in her tone made both her mother and the sheriff step back slightly. Over the next hour, the office filled with townspeople who'd heard about Eliza May's return. Some came out of genuine concern, but others were clearly drawn by curiosity and gossip. They whispered among themselves, speculating about what had happened in the mountains, what relationship existed between the respectable farmer's daughter and the notorious mountain man. Judge Harrison Blackwood arrived as the sun was setting, bringing with him the full weight of territorial law. He was an imposing man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. Unlike Sheriff Garrett, Blackwood had a reputation for fairness and wisdom. "Miss Carpenter," he said formally, "I understand you've had quite an ordeal. Perhaps you'd be willing to tell us exactly what transpired." Eliza May looked around the crowded office at the faces surrounding her. She saw suspicion, curiosity, fear and judgment, but little sympathy or understanding. These people had lived safe lives in their comfortable town while her family was being destroyed. Now they wanted to sit in judgment of the man who'd helped her seek justice. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "2 weeks ago, a band of rogue warriors attacked my family's farm. They killed my father, burned our home, and took me prisoner. For 5 days, I was held captive, chained like an animal, subjected to treatment that I will not describe in polite company." The room fell silent, hanging on her every word. "Nathan Walker found me and freed me at great personal risk. He could have simply pointed me toward town and wished me luck. Instead, he chose to help me track down the men who murdered my father. For over a week, we fought a guerrilla war in the mountains against 8 hardened warriors. And now, they're all dead," Sheriff Garrett interjected. 8 men killed in what amounts to a private war. 8 murderers who will never again raid innocent farms or terrorize helpless families," Eliza May corrected. 8 animals who got exactly what they deserved. Judge Blackwood studied her face carefully. "Miss Carpenter, I understand your desire for revenge, but the law exists to prevent exactly this kind of vigilante justice. What's to stop every person with a grievance from taking up arms and dispensing their own version of justice? What's to stop murderers and raiders when the law is too weak or too distant to protect innocent people?" Eliza May shot back. "Your Honor, with respect, the law failed my family. It failed me. The only justice we received was the justice we took for ourselves." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some voices expressed agreement with her position, while others condemned her actions as lawless and dangerous. Martha Carpenter had been listening in growing horror as her daughter described weeks of violence and warfare. "Eliza May," she whispered, "what have you become?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Eliza May looked at her mother, seeing the fear and confusion in her eyes. Martha Carpenter had raised a gentle farm girl who helped with chores and attended church on Sundays. The woman standing before her now was something else entirely. "I became what I needed to become to survive," Eliza May said quietly. "I became what I needed to become to avenge Papa's murder. I became someone who refuses to be a victim." On the examination table, Ridge stirred slightly, his fevered mind responding to the sound of her voice. Dr. Morrison immediately turned his attention back to his patient, checking pulse and breathing. "His condition is stabilizing," Morrison announced. "The fever is breaking, and his pulse is stronger. I think he's going to pull through." Relief flooded through Eliza May, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Ridge's recovery would only bring new problems. Sheriff Garrett was already making plans for his arrest, and Judge Blackwood was clearly struggling with the legal implications of their mountain war. "Your Honor," Eliza May said, stepping forward, "we want to make something clear. Everything that happened in the mountains was my choice. Nathan Walker did nothing but help a woman seek justice for her murdered father. If you want to arrest someone for vigilante justice, arrest me. I was the one who demanded vengeance. I was the one who pulled the triggers." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Martha Carpenter gasped and reached for her daughter as if to pull her back from the brink of self-destruction. Judge Blackwood raised his hand for silence. "Miss Carpenter, I appreciate your loyalty to Mr. Walker, but the law doesn't work that way. Both of you will be held accountable for your actions." "Then we'll face that accountability together," Eliza May said firmly. "Nathan Walker is twice the man of anyone in this room, and I won't stand by while you condemn him for helping me." As the crowd continued to debate her fate and Ridge's, Eliza May stood beside the examination table, one hand resting protectively on his shoulder. She'd found something in the mountains that she'd never expected, not just revenge, but purpose, strength, and perhaps even love. Now the question was whether the civilized world would allow her to keep any of it. The trial that would determine both their fates was set to begin the next morning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.